Welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. In the year 2026, America will celebrate our 250th birthday. It's an extraordinary milestone, and one we here at the White House Historical Association are looking forward to commemorating along with all of you. As we approach this semi-quincentennial, we are reminded by our guests today that this country, an American democracy, has been shaped, guided, and defined by only 45 individuals who've held the title President of the United States. We're talking to our good friend, David Rubenstein, the co-founder and co-chair of the Carlyle Group. But before starting a global investment firm, David was a proud public servant who worked on Jimmy Carter's White House staff and is himself a part of White House history. He's an American patriot whose philanthropy has greatly impacted our educational mission at the White House Historical Association. And we're very proud to be the stewards of David Rubenstein's National Center for White House History. In fact, we're seated here today at our new immersive museum experience called the People's House, a White House Experience, in front of this large model of the White House portico, which David generously sponsored. This model greets our visitors when they enter the experience space, and it really is quite something to see up close. We're located at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, and we've just opened. So we invite all of you to come visit us. You can plan your trip and register for free tickets at the website www.thepeopleshouse.org. We're grateful to David for his continuing support and his friendship, and we're excited to share with you his newest book, The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency. This book is a collection of conversations with noted historians as well as a few presidential family members, and even interviews with several presidents that David did himself. There's a lot to get to, so let's jump in. David, thank you so much for being with us here today. I have your new book here. And clearly from the title, this is a book about private equity, The Highest Calling.
Well, as you may know, for many years I have said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, the highest calling of mankind was private equity, but obviously the highest calling of mankind is probably the presidency. Because when you think about it, of the 7 or 8 billion people on the face of the earth, who actually has the most responsibility? Who's the most important person on the face of the earth? Well, certainly in Western society, it probably would be the President of the United States, at least since Woodrow Wilson's time.
In the opening, the dedication of this book, you dedicate it to Ted Sorensen and Stuart Eizenstat. And Mr. Eizenstat has just written a new book, The Art of Diplomacy, which I've read, and we're having him on a panel later this fall. Why those two, and why are they meaningful to you?
When I was a young boy, I admired John Kennedy, and as I got later through schooling, I realized that a lot of his great speeches were written by Ted Sorensen. Sorensen was his intellectual blood bank, you might say. And I didn't think I could be a candidate. I didn't have the charm, the handsome look that Kennedy had, the money, all the things that Kennedy had. So I didn't think I could be a candidate, but I thought I maybe could be an advisor. And therefore, Ted Sorensen was a role model. And I went to work at a law firm in New York where he was practicing law. So I spent a couple years working with him. And then Stuart Eizenstat ultimately gave me a job where I could be his deputy at the White House. So Ted Sorensen is the one who inspired me to want to be a White House aide. And Stuart Eizenstat was the person who gave me the job that enabled me to be a White House aide.
So you worked in the White House, so you yourself are part of White House history, but you grew up in Baltimore. Do you remember visiting the White House as a young boy, or what were your memories of the first time you went into the building?
I hate to say that the first time I was in the building was not until much later in life. It wasn't easy to be a tourist in the White House in those days, and my parents used to bring me to the Smithsonian and all those other museums, but I don't think they really had the ability to figure out how to get into the White House, so they didn't do that. When I was working on the Carter administration, we had a transition in 76 before we actually took over in 77. And I was a part of the White House transition team, and one of our jobs was to go meet the chief of staff to learn how we should transition in. And that chief of staff was a guy named Dick Cheney, who said to us, what you should do is this: as soon as the inauguration occurs, you guys are in charge. But sometimes you might stay up in the inaugural festivities for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So from 12 to 3, nobody will be here. We're not coming in. So make sure you have some people in the White House, otherwise there could be an emergency, nobody's responding. So I went back and told the Carter people that, and they said, well, we're going up the inaugural stuff. You go into the White House. So I said, okay. So at 12 o'clock, I walked across from Blair House into the White House security gate, and I said, hey, I'm David Rubenstein from the new Carter administration. They said, well, where's your security pass? And I didn't have one, and they didn't have me in the computer or anything, so it took me about 2 hours to talk my way into the White House. Fortunately, there were no emergencies in the first 2 hours.
President Carter obviously has lived longer post-presidency than any other American presidency. As we reflect back on his presidency and your memories of that time, how will history view President Carter, and what is your memory and perspective on him?
Well, remember, many times people leave office and they're not as popular when they leave office as they later become. The best example of that in recent years is Harry Truman. Harry Truman left with a popularity rating of maybe 20%, very unpopular at the time. Now, as a result of David McCullough's book and other books that have been done on Truman's presidency, he's well regarded as a very good president. When President Carter left office, he lost overwhelmingly to Ronald Reagan, and he felt somewhat humiliated by it, and he really kind of was almost clinically depressed for a while because he lost by so much. Later, he rebuilt his life and did the Carter Center kinds of activities, election monitoring, worrying about guinea worm and river blindness, other kinds of things. And as a result of the 40 years he's been out of office, compared to the 4 years in office, the 40 years seems like he's done so much compared to the 4 years. But now people like Stuart Eizenstat, my former boss, have written a book about what Carter actually did as president, and it turns out he actually got a lot done. Because at that time, Carter would propose a lot of legislation, he would get maybe half of it done, but that half was much more than recent presidents have been able to get done. Today, if you can get your appropriation bills done and a debt limit bill done and maybe one major bill, you're considered really successful. Carter got an enormous amount of things done, just didn't get everything done.
Today, we're sitting here in the gallery with the White House model behind us in the People's House, a White House Experience, which is the newest undertaking of the White House Historical Association.
Thanks for getting that done.
Well, thank you for helping make it possible. This gallery will bear your name, and you'll see it right there when we open later in September. But what is it about the White House, this building, in the context of American history, that is important? And why is studying White House history and the work of the association important as one of our great supporters?
Well, first of all, studying any history is important because I think you learn from the past. So the White House is a symbol of the country in many ways. It's the most recognizable house, not only in the United States, but maybe in the world. And so what it really represents is not just a home, but a symbol of the presidency. The presidency has become the most important, I think, job in the Western world, certainly. And the people that have occupied it, the 40 plus people who have done it, are people that have had incredible stories. Some were great heroes in war. Some were people that worked their way up through government. But many of them have done things that made our life much better in this country. Some of them helped us get through wars. Some of us helped get through things like the Depression and so forth. So we look up to the presidents as role models. Now, everyone hasn't been a great role model, and some presidents are very unpopular. But still, we honor the presidency for what it means, because it really means it's really a symbol of our country. So when the president is doing well, the country is doing well. And when the president isn't doing well, the country isn't doing well. So when you talk to the White House and you go talk about the White House, you visit the White House, you're really visiting the symbols of the country. And so to me, the White House really represents the country, and therefore I think it's an important thing for people to know. If you don't know the history of the past, you're likely to make the same mistakes that were made in the past. The theory of studying history is you learn from the past, correct the mistakes, and do better in the future.
In this book, you cover 21 of 45 men who've been president and one First Lady, Secretary Clinton. Why these 21?
Well, these are people that the presidents I interviewed were presidents I had access to. I did some interviews of them for the book and some prior to the book, and I put them in the book. And then scholars I talked to were people who were scholars about great presidents like Washington or Lincoln and so forth. And obviously there's plenty of books on Washington and Lincoln, so what's different? Well, I tried through my interviews to ask questions that people might not always ask, and I try to pick some authors about various things about a particular president people might not know. So for example, there have been an infinite number of books on FDR. He was president longer than anybody else. But I talked to an author, a relatively young author named Jonathan Darman, about how Roosevelt went from being a dilettante, not all that smart a person in the view of many of his peers, and not all that accomplished a person, to being maybe one of the greatest presidents of all time. And he said this because when he came down with polio, he had to reinvent himself. Probably had he had a doctor who was good, in the first days or two of the illness, he would have recognized it was polio, gotten appropriate treatment. They didn't do that, and the result was he was paralyzed the rest of his life. But the determination to overcome that polio, to appear to be walking, and to re-engage with life was what gave him the determination and the grit and the power to be a great president, at least in the view of Jonathan Dartmouth. So it's a different perspective. Another one I would mention is Lincoln, for example. There's an infinite number of books on Lincoln. I think in the history of the world, there's never been more books written about anybody than Lincoln, probably, with the possible exception of Jesus Christ. Lincoln had more books written about him than anybody. So why talk about Lincoln? Well, there's a book that came out that I didn't really know much about before, an area of Lincoln's life that I didn't know much about before, which was the travel from Springfield to Washington when he was inaugurated as president. And it had a very circuitous train route. He did about 67 stops, 60-some speeches, like going to Philadelphia, New York. He had to avoid the South when he going through in the train because he thought he could be assassinated there. And actually, when going through Baltimore, there was an assassination plot. He had to use a circuitous route to get through Baltimore and get here. So it's an interesting story about
Orioles fans, I think they were.
Right, no doubt. So it's an interesting, different aspect of Lincoln's life that maybe people don't know much about.
So you yourself are the master interviewer, and you interviewed for this book Presidents Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. If you yourself could interview any president in the past, who would you choose to interview and why?
Well, there's no doubt Lincoln was, in my view, the greatest president. He got us through the Civil War. Many people in the North in those days would not have said, let's keep the Union together. They would have said, if you want to go away to the South, go away. And the country would have split up. In addition, he freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately the 13th Amendment. We don't have any interviews of Lincoln. And the reason we don't have any interviews of Washington is the interview format as we know it didn't really exist in those days. So there was no TV talk shows in those days. Lincoln didn't do radio shows. And so we don't really have an interview. So if I could do an interview of anybody, I'd like to do one of him because he was I think our greatest president. What he was great at doing was not only solving the problems of the Civil War and the things associated with slavery, but he was humble. He didn't walk around the White House saying, I just won the Civil War, aren't I great? He wasn't bragging about it. He also, although not really educated in any formal way, he was the most literate of presidents. He wrote the Gettysburg Address, the Second Inaugural Address, which are literary masterpieces and really live on for centuries.
If you read this book and you study our presidents in American history, you realize that these are 45 very different men. In fact, one of the few things they have in common, maybe the only thing, is they lived and worked in this building called the White House, except for George Washington, who selected the land and identified the young Irish immigrant architect to build it. In your studies, your research, your interviews, what are there other common threads that are among these 45 men?
Well, they obviously have, with very few exceptions, a lot of ambition. If you think about this, when you're becoming president of the United States, you're saying, of all the people in the United States, I deserve to be the leader of the country. It takes some ambition and some ego to do that. Now, some people probably didn't really want to be president. Calvin Coolidge, who's in the book, wasn't obsessed with being president. He came there because, in fact, Harding, who was president, died, and Coolidge, as vice president, succeeded him. But he wasn't a person who bragged about himself very much and actually was happy to ultimately retire back to New England. But they all have in common ambition and reasonable intelligence. I would say their ability to get along with people, though some people were not perfect in that regard. But I think ambition, self-confidence is generally what you see in somebody that becomes president. And one other thing that I would mention is this. Most people in life, when they are in grade school or high school or college, they see certain people are really stars. They're really brilliant people. They're great athletes. They're the kind of people you say, I want to follow this person. That's not true of most people who became president. Very few times will you see a person who was in grade school a great leader, in high school a great leader, at college a great leader, and he went on to become president of the United States. Usually they're people that were not all that impressive when they were younger, and through a lot of luck they got to be a president of the United States. With the one exception in the 20th century is probably Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a student leader. He was a Rhodes Scholar. But you think about it, Rhodes Scholars are supposed to be great leaders, but in the history of the Rhodes Scholarship Program, this goes back to 1900, only one has emerged as president of the United States. So what they often have in common is they had a circuitous route to become president, and they weren't people that people said when they were kids, this kid's going to be president of the United States someday.
You cite, as we talked about earlier, Ted Sorensen and Stuart Eisenstadt as influential on your life and inspirational to you. Did you find that there were leaders are those that these presidents looked to, that inspired them, that brought them up?
Sure, everybody has some person that they're inspired by or a mentor, and many of these people were helped along by people that aren't famous themselves, but that helped people become president. And so there are many people who orchestrated campaigns for people who became president. There are many people who were advisors to people who became president, and they're not as well known, but sure, everybody has somebody like that.
In the book of Esther in the Bible, Queen Esther is approached by her cousin, who's told, you should go to your husband, King Xerxes, that you are uniquely equipped for such a time as this to have him free the Jewish people. So she was given that mantle, the woman who's the queen for such a time as this. Are there presidents in our history who you think were equipped with the uniqueness to be the president for their time, for such a time as this?
Well, Lincoln is one of them. Washington was another. Washington didn't really want to be president. No male member of his family had lived past the age of 50, and he was 56 or 7 when he was becoming president. He didn't really want to be president, but he had the kind of authority that enabled him to become a leader because he had been the general during the Revolutionary War. Lincoln worked out well for his times. He saved the Union, in my view. FDR kept the country going through the Depression and got us through World War II, I should say. And was an incredible leader. I think leaders later in life that I think fit the times were John Kennedy as a young, vibrant leader. Ronald Reagan, his time, I think inspired the country to do more than it might otherwise have done. So we've had some credible people become president, despite the fact that very few of them would be predicted to have become president when they were younger. Nobody would have predicted Ronald Reagan to be president of the United States when he was a young boy.
So we have with us today representatives from our Next Generation Leaders Group at the White House Historical Association. And I know that they all truly aspire to continue their careers in private equity, have a successful career in private equity. But if it turns out that they could only be president of the United States and not in private equity, what advice and counsel would you have for them? And I know we envy the position they are in life, starting out and having all this opportunity before them.
My advice generally is if you want to be a leader, you need to know where you want to go. You have to have some vision. You have to be able to persuade people to follow you. So you have to be relatively articulate orally so people will listen to you, or you know how to write reasonably well, but most importantly, read. You can't read too much. And very often today, people regard reading as reading a tweet might be regarded as reading. But there's nothing the same as reading a book. A book focuses the brain. And I really try to read as many books as I can because you learn a lot from books. And I tell people when I speak at a graduation or so, that a commencement the word for commencement means beginning. It's not the end of an education, it's the beginning. And you have to learn how to persuade people, learn how to write, learn how to read, and learn how to do something more important than just worry about yourself. Worry about other people and worry about the country in some cases, but worry about what you can do to make the world a better place. We're all on this earth for a relatively short period of time in the grand span of things. Why do you really want to live? What's the purpose of life? We don't really know, but certainly it must be to help more people than just yourself. And so I try to encourage people to try to think of what they can do beyond just worrying about their own daily needs and help other people. And that's often what you see leaders do, and they often sometimes become president of the United States.
In the encouragement to read, best presidential biographies that you would encourage people to read?
Well, there are a lot of great presidential biographies. Lincoln, I think there's a score of great books, and one of the most recent ones that got a lot of attention is the one by Doris Kearns Goodwin, where she talks about Lincoln and how he brought his cabinet together, a disparate group of people, and he put them all together. And I think that's a great biography of Lincoln. I think Ron Chernow's biography on George Washington won the Pulitzer Prize, a great biography for sure. I had some books in here that I thought were great biographies of presidents, but in the end, I think what people should do, and what I'm trying to do with this book, is to get people to realize that presidents are different. You should learn as much as you can about them, and then vote. We only have about 2/3 of Americans who are eligible to vote, voting every time we have a presidential election, which means that you have more or less about 80 million Americans who are eligible to vote but are not voting. So just think how different elections would be if 80 million more people voted. And I think that it's important as a citizen to vote. You know, it's a right that we've earned over many hundreds of years. We've had millions of Americans die protecting our liberties and our freedoms, including our right to vote. And it's a shame that sometimes people just don't exercise their right to vote.
We evaluate our presidential candidates now through debates, advertising, Twitter, other people telling us what we should think and believe. In the early times of our country, there were not those assets, if you consider them assets or benefits. How did people judge those leadership qualities and assess a candidate in the early part of our country before the media and we had the benefit of the wisdom of others telling us how to vote?
Well, remember, when the country was set up, it was generally thought that the average person in this country wasn't smart enough or informed enough to be a voter. So the Electoral College was set up where you had electors who were supposedly well-versed individuals who were qualified to decide who should be president of the United States. That's why we have the system we still have, even though today people presumably are better informed than they were back in the 1700s. So I think that in those days, you talked to elites, and elites would talk to other elites, and they would kind of say, this person is a talented person, this person is a leader. There was obviously some self-promotion going on. Lincoln is seen as a person who was selflessly promoted to be the nominee of the party in 1860, but he was actually working very hard to do that. The convention was in Chicago. He was well connected in Illinois, obviously, and so he was certainly behind the scenes pushing himself forward. Some presidents appear not to have actually been interested at all. For example, Garfield, who only served for 4 months, he nominated at the convention that year somebody else to be president, and he didn't really want to be president, and he resisted it, and it took many, many ballots before he actually succumbed and say, yes, I'll be willing to be the candidate. So some presidents, I think, don't really desire to be president, and it happens by luck. For example, Harry Truman. Harry Truman was a senator from Missouri. He'd only met Franklin Roosevelt once in his life when Roosevelt actually asked him to be vice president, getting rid of the previous vice president he had. He didn't like Henry Wallace. And Truman, during the time as vice president, only met Roosevelt once, only once. And yet he didn't know many of the secrets, and he kind of didn't really plan to be, a president of the United States. It wasn't in his ambition. And, just a few years before, he had been a farmer, and as his mother-in-law said, he was trailing a mule's rear end, and that's probably what he appropriately should be doing. And that's how little his mother-in-law thought of him. But I would say he's an example of somebody who didn't aspire to be president and got there, and the results were pretty good for the country.
As we sit here in early fall of 2024, before the election, the United States in our soon-to-be 250-year history has never had a woman president. But we have this strange role called First Lady. Of the First Ladies that were married or worked with, equipped the presidencies or the lives of their husbands as president, who do you think was the most influential and impactful in making those men who they were?
Well, I think Hillary Clinton, you'd have to say, was very, very influential. Now, she was seen as his real intellectual partner, and when he ran for president the first time, in fact, they said, you get two for the price of one. It was clear from the beginning she was going to be an intellectual partner, and she did run his healthcare task force. But it wasn't that unusual even then to have a woman be more and more assertive in her role with her husband. What was more unusual was when Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady. She had been a relatively docile, not that interested in politics kind of person. In fact, she had initially opposed the 19th Amendment. She initially didn't really think that women should have the right to vote. Later, she changed her mind on that. But because her husband couldn't really travel, he was not easily travel, she was his eyes and ears, and she would run around the country and talk about things with people and bring back ideas to him. And so she was an influential First Lady. But maybe the most influential of them all was President Wilson's second wife. President Wilson had a stroke when he was trying to get the League of Nations approved by the Senate, and it was a much more severe stroke than people realized. He was essentially bedridden for the last 18 months of his life. His wife basically protected him and covered up for him that he couldn't really do many things, and as a result, she was making decisions about who should come and see him, what bills he should sign, what kind of proclamations he should issue. So she probably had more influence than anybody because she, in effect, was almost like an acting president.
Every year, historians release their list of the best ranked presidents from 1st to 45th. And some are increasing in rank with the context and perspective of history. Your top 5, not in any certain order, but who would you say are the best through that prism of history that you have the benefit of understanding?
Well, I think that the best 5 presidents in our country's history will range depending on who you ask. And I did surveys when I was preparing for this book, and you find sometimes The person who's rated the best president is also rated maybe the worst president. But in my own view, the greatest presidents were Lincoln and Washington, a league by themselves, for the reasons I've described. I think FDR, because he was president longer than anybody else that got us through the Depression and World War II, probably have to be third. I think Jefferson, because of his intellectual prowess, doubling the size of the Union through the Louisiana Purchase, would probably have to be up there. And he is, of course, on Mount Rushmore. And also on Mount Rushmore is Teddy Roosevelt, who had an enormous amount of influence, and he probably could have served another 4 years as president had he not given up the mantle to turn it over to William Howard Taft at one point. In the modern era of my lifetime, I would say John Kennedy, although he was only president for 1,000 days or so, impact on the country that I think was disproportionate to the short time he served. I think many people would say Ronald Reagan had an enormous amount of influence as well and would go down in history as a great president.
You have something in common with many of our American presidents, and that's the love of the great American pastime, baseball. As the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, I hope you've noticed my Orioles cufflinks.
Those are very good cufflinks.
I'm wearing there. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you could invite a few of our past presidents to sit in your box tonight for the game against the White Sox, who would you invite?
Well, I'd love to sit down with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, FDR, John Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, my former boss Jimmy Carter, and talk about baseball. You know, baseball was considered for a long time the American pastime, the national pastime, and presidents used to go out and throw out the first pitch. But today, presidents don't do that much because usually when you go to stadiums, politicians get booed, so they tend not to go as much. But I do think that many presidents really, really enjoyed baseball, and every president seems to have some sport that they enjoy. Today, golf seems to be one of the more popular ones, but I think most of them know a fair bit about baseball and knew a fair bit about baseball throughout history.
Have a little bit of a lightning round for you
Sure.
on presidents. Best decision maker?
Well, I think Abraham Lincoln making the decision to emancipate the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation is probably one of the best decisions any president's ever made.
Abraham Lincoln may be the answer to many of these, but chose the best people to put around them.
Well, many people did that, and Lincoln is also a person that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote about. He took his rivals and put them in the cabinet. But I'd say in more modern times, I think John Kennedy had a pretty extraordinary group of people as serving in his cabinet. I think Barack Obama had some very talented people as well. Remember, cabinet positions are less important than they probably were years ago. Lincoln had about 3 people on his four cabinet members, a relatively small cabinet. I think Washington only had 3 people in his cabinet. We now have very large cabinets and attract a lot of talented people, but presidents don't rely on them as much as they rely on White House staff people today.
Ahead of their time?
Well, Lincoln was ahead of his time for sure, because he is a person who was willing to get rid of slavery in a way that upset many, many people for sure. Had he said, I'm not going to fight the Civil War, I'm just going to keep the Union in the North and forget the South, that would have been probably more popular in the South and certainly in parts of the North, but he was ahead of his time by trying to hold the country together.
Learned from a failing?
Well, there's no doubt that John Kennedy, when he did the Bay of Pigs, was inexperienced. He had made a mistake. He went on television and did something very unusual. He said, I made a mistake, and I bear responsibility. Ever since then, other politicians have tried to follow suit. Because Kennedy, when he admitted a mistake in the Bay of Pigs, his popularity went up. And people have said, well, maybe if you admit a mistake, your popularity will go up. Now, sometimes presidents will say, I bear the responsibility, I'm sorry, but it's really not my fault. So if you really want to bear responsibility, say it's your fault, take the blame, and go on to do something else better. But today, I think Kennedy is a perfect example of a president who learned from a mistake and made a big mistake in the Bay of Pigs.
Most effective president on the global stage?
I think George Herbert Walker Bush would be probably in that category because he fought the war in Kuwait. He won overwhelmingly there with a coalition that he and Jim Baker put together. He also didn't dance on the grave of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he helped reunite Germany, which was not all that popular at the time. Many people did not want to see a reunited Germany. As Margaret Thatcher liked to say, I love Germany so much I want 2 of them.
President that we can be thankful did not have Twitter or X?
Well, Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant person. He wrote thousands and thousands of letters, of which we have many of them remaining. I suspect he would have been on Twitter all the time because he loved to communicate. He was a person who didn't like to make speeches. As President of the United States, he only made one public speech, his first inaugural address. He never made another public speech. He had a high squeaky voice, and he didn't like to talk in public, but he loved to write, so I suspect he would be on Twitter, or what's now called X.
Talk about presidential oratory, the best orator as president, and the dynamic of television versus, have Lincoln at Gettysburg and thousands of people.
Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, 272 words, was only 2 minutes. In fact, the cameras weren't really set up before he sat down because they just weren't ready when he made his speech, and he was over in 2 minutes. So we don't really see it as great oratory in the traditional sense, but the words resonate. A great speechmaker, I think, would be someone like John Kennedy, who gave the inaugural address that was incredible, one of the best inaugural addresses ever. He gave some other great speeches. The moonshot speech is another famous one. And I think Ronald Reagan was pretty good at making speeches too. Some of his speeches, they tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev was a famous speech. His speech after the Challenger crash was a great speech. The speech at Pointe du Hoc was a wonderful speech for celebrating the D-Day anniversary. He was a great speech maker. I think Barack Obama was a pretty good speech maker as well. To be a good speech maker, you have to really get into the speech. In other words, if you're just given the speech by a speech writer, in these days, speech writers really write the speeches typically, it's not as good as if you actually work through the speech and you really own it yourself. And sometimes presidents tend to just read things that were written for them, and they don't spend as much time dealing with the speech as maybe they should.
The president whose high school classmates would likely vote them most likely to be president.
Well, that would probably be Bill Clinton, because he was a star in high school, and most presidents were not stars in high schools. Very rarely do you see that was the case. Some of them would have been voted least likely to become president of the United States.
And who would that have been?
Well, I don't want to denigrate any president, but I would say in my own case, people would say I'm the least likely person to ever become a White House aide in my high school class or college class, because I wasn't a superstar the way many other people in my class were.
President who didn't take themselves too seriously.
Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge just didn't really want to be president that much. He didn't take himself seriously, and he didn't like to talk very much. And there's a famous example of this when a woman came to him and said, "I have a bet that I can get you to say more than 2 words," and he famously said, "You lose."
President that you would hire to be a partner at Carlyle.
Well, there's some of them I'd like to have hired, and George Herbert Walker Bush wasn't a partner, but he spent a lot of time with us. I think he would be good. I think Bill Clinton would be very good too, because he had the ability to get along with people, and very, very smart person. Barack Obama, very, very smart person as well.
Population Reference Bureau estimates that in the history of the Earth, 117 billion people have lived, 117 billion souls. 45 men have been president of the United States. Probably be less than 100 in the history of America will be in that role. Why those 45 men? What's special about them? What's the uniqueness of that calling to be that title, the highest calling in the span of world history?
Well, they all had some luck to get there. Nobody could say that they hired McKinsey and McKinsey came up with a strategy of how they could become president of the United States. Luck is true in everything. You look at corporate CEO positions, or you look at people running universities, they all had some luck to get there. And so there's always luck involved in getting to somewhere. The 45 who became president of the United States probably never imagined it would happen, and they were pinching themselves when it happened. I remember there's a famous story of John Kennedy sitting in the Oval Office the first day with Pierre Salinger and saying, "Hey, I think somebody's going to come in here and kick us out because we don't really belong here," because he couldn't believe he really belonged in the Oval Office.
George Washington and Abraham Lincoln could appear with us now and spend 24 hours in America today. Would they be surprised, excited, disappointed, inspired?
Well, when the country was created, I think some people had the idea that we would be an important country, but nobody, I think, would have thought in the early days of the country that we'd become the most powerful economic, military, cultural, technological force on the face of the earth for such a long time. Nobody probably could have predicted that. So I think they would all be surprised. And I say in the beginning of the book, though, that what probably most surprised our founders, would surprise our founders if they came back today, is the fact that an African American became president of the United States. Because in those days, they were slaves. African Americans were slaves, and the chance to get the right to vote or be a citizen was considered very remote. Become president of the United States, nobody would have anticipated. The same is true with a woman becoming president. As we talk today, the Democratic Party candidate, Kamala Harris, is obviously a woman, and she could be president of the United States. And that was something I think nobody would have thought possible at the beginning of this country.
2026, America will celebrate our 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial. You have a great heart and passion for history, for civics education, things that our nation is in critical need of. When we celebrated the bicentennial in 1976, it was more of a celebration. This might be more of a reflection. How do you see this upcoming experience of America's 250th, and what's important for us as a nation to get out of this?
Well, I think if getting people to learn how to say semi-quincentennial will be a big challenge. Very few people probably can get that out of their mouth. But I think we should reflect on the fact that the country has done incredible things over the 250 years, and we should think about why are we celebrating the 250th on the time we're celebrating it, because the Declaration of Independence is what we're celebrating, did not really create a country. We broke away from a country. It really wasn't until the Constitution was put into effect much later that we actually became a real country with a governing structure that now works. It's amazing that the Constitution has lived for all these years with relatively modest amendments. We've had 27 amendments, but 10 of them were the Bill of Rights. So we've relatively kept with the document that was drafted by rich, Christian, property-owning men. And think about it. We have a very diverse country today, and wealthy Christian men, property-owning men, are not the majority of the country. Yet we're living with a system, more or less with some amendments, that was created by these people. So it's amazing that it's still in existence. But the Declaration of Independence does deserve a lot of credit because it had in it the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That sentence is what inspired America, I think, to try to live up to the idea of equality. Now, we've obviously not had equality perfectly, but that sentence captured what it became the creed of our country. And so we really celebrate the Declaration of Independence, not so much because it created a country, but because it has a sentence in there that really inspired the country to kind of live up to the ideals of the Founding Fathers, even though we've had a lot of challenges getting there.
If I were to contemplate a title for your biography, I would say Master of Business, Soul of the Patriotic Philanthropist, the Artistic Interviewer, and soon to be owner of a World Series championship a baseball team. But looking back on all your achievements and accomplishments, all the presidents that you've met and interacted with, all the experiences that you've had, how do you see your life, your influence, and your legacy? And I'd like to think about it in the terms of all that you've invested in for history and civics education.
Well, I think probably not as influential as you would say. I hope that I have inspired some people to want to give back to the country. What I've called patriotic philanthropy is designed to remind people of the history and heritage of the country, on the theory that if you learn more about the history and heritage of the country, you can avoid the mistakes we made in the past. So, I don't really think much about it, except that as I get older, I think that my obituary will be coming sooner and sooner. And so I didn't imagine I would live this long. And, when you get to be a certain age, I'm now 75, an age that seemed unimaginable to me as a young person, you do think more and more about what's going to happen when you're not around. And I realize increasingly that there are a few things that I've done that will probably remain on for a while, but maybe some of the things I've done in the historic patriotic philanthropy will live on.
Well, of the many, this will be one where we're sitting today, the People's House, a White House experience that we think thousands and thousands, if not millions of young people, students of all ages, will learn more about the White House and its history and apply that to their own lives and their own civic participation.
Well,
so thank you very much.
Thank you for getting it done. I don't think it would have gotten done if you hadn't done all the hard work and the money raising and the effort. And as we sit here today, I'm amazed that it got done, because when I first saw it, I thought it's never going to get done, but it did.
Well, here we are.
Thank you.
And it has been done. Last question. What didn't I ask you about this book? It's a message that you would like to convey.
Well, you didn't ask me where you can buy the book. All the proceeds go to charity, and they go to children's hospitals. So I'm really interested in just educating people. But, you didn't ask me whether there's going to be a sequel, I guess, or who's going to play me in the movie, I guess. You didn't ask me that.
Well, are we going to announce your campaign for president in 2028?
Not anytime soon.
You're still too young, I think, to be president.
Too young to be president, right. I need a couple more years of seasoning.
That's great. Well, thank you, David,
Thanks
for
very
all
much,
you do
Stuart.
for us and for writing this extraordinary book.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to our Next Gen leaders who have joined us here today and their bright and promising futures.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode. And please watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping fund the education mission through our teacher programming, our publishing, our White House History Live in-person and virtual events, the members-only virtual history happy hour, and our latest initiative, the People's House, a White House experience. We're bringing the White House and its storied history to life at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. The People's House is an immersive experience and open to everyone. Plan your visit today at the website, thepeopleshouse.org. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.